Well, thank you. Let me start by thanking Democracy Action and its founder, Mr. Lee Short, for having invited me to write a response to the He Puapua report, and also for having flown me back to New Zealand to talk about it. My wife and I had 11 wonderful years in Dunedin from 1993 to 2004 at the wonderful Otago Law School, which was then neither woke nor committed to identity politics nor remotely interested in cancel culture frolics. During that time, we added New Zealand nationality to our panoply of passports. I'm a native-born Canadian, and it's always a pleasure to come back to this very beautiful country. It's true that I normally travel to the South Island, but as long as none of our old Dunedin friends find out that I'm up here in the North Island, I think all's going to be well. I will add this caveat that I came into New Zealand on the last day where you had to go and get a rat test, and boy, was that annoying. So I'm here today, and the requirement has ended. But to change tack, I'm wondering how many people in the audience know the story of the New Zealand cricket captain, Kane Williamson, who a little while ago happened to be holidaying on the Gold Coast in Queensland, where I live in Brisbane. And Kane was walking down the beach one morning when he stubbed his toe on an old Middle Eastern looking lamp. And so he stooped and he picked it up, and in doing so, out swished a genie. Now, this wasn't your ordinary genie. This was a very, very special genie. And so she said to Kane Williamson, yes, I'm a genie, and yes, you get 3 wishes. Ask for anything you like, but you need to know this, that whatever you ask for, all the players on the Australian and English cricket teams, all the players on the Test cricket teams there will get double. So whatever you ask, you get 1, and they get double. So what'd you like for your first wish? So Williamson, he thought, he said, I'd like $1 million. So the genie blinked her eyes, and she said, well, you have $1 million, but remember, every member of the Australian and English cricket teams, they now have $2 million in their bank account. So what's your second wish? Kane pondered, said, I've always wanted a sporty motor car built with German precision and engineering and know-how. So the genie blinked, poof. She said, well, when you go home tonight in your driveway, you'll find a top-of-the-line BMW sports car. But remember, every English and Australian Test cricketer now has 2 BMWs in their driveways. So what's your final wish? So Kane pondered, and finally he leaned over to the genie and he said, I've always wanted to donate a kidney. All right, I told that joke to a buddy in Brisbane. He's a Kiwi. And he said, well, given that the brunt of the joke are palms and Aussies, you should replace kidneys with testicles. But given how few politicians in today's Western woke world are able to define what a woman is, I just decided to stick with the original version. So let me now move to why I'm here. A couple months ago, I was commissioned by Democracy Action to write a report about a New Zealand government funded and commissioned report. The English name for it is the 2019 report of the Working Group on a Plan to Realize the UNDRIP Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples in Aotearoa / New Zealand. The authors also gave it a Maori name, He Puapua. Now, according to them, I wouldn't know, but according to them, that Maori name means a break, usually a break in the waves. And they go on explicitly to say that they want a break in the usual political and societal norms and approaches in this country. And they say that this break will initiate, they hope, a change to New Zealand's constitution. Now, of course, they say the Aotearoa's constitution, but many of you will already have guessed that. The new version will be rooted in the Treaty of Waitangi and in that just mentioned UN declaration. So now the first thing to say is that the authors could not have been more upfront. They want big ticket, massive constitutional change, and they signal that right at the start. Presumably the Ardern government that commissioned this He Puapua report realized they were asking for a radical report, and that is what was delivered. Now, it might be worth pausing for a second right at the beginning to remind people that New Zealand shares the British Dyson unwritten constitution that's anchored in parliamentary sovereignty. Along with the American checks and balances Madisonian constitutional model, these are the two most successful constitutional models in the modern world. Nothing else comes close. And though both have stood the test of time, both have delivered stability, democracy, and enviable outcomes in any comparative sense over long periods of time, personally, I have a slight preference for the Dyson unwritten model to the American one. So if I could put it simply, I think the current New Zealand unwritten constitution that has parliamentary sovereignty at its heart is the best model so far tried. If you'd like, you can put my position in Churchillian terms, the way Mr. Churchill described democracy itself, by saying something along the lines of, the New Zealand constitutional model is the worst one going, except for every other model that has so far ever been tried. That's my position. And remember, it's the current New Zealand constitutional model that saw New Zealand be the first country in the world that granted women the vote, a long time before they got it in North America. It was the model that saw 4 electorates or constituencies specifically set aside for Maori. It was Maori men at the time, as only men back then could vote for MPs. But this was done way back in 1867. It was the same unwritten Kiwi constitutional model that saw New Zealand be the first country in the democratic world to bring in a panoply of social democratic laws in the early decades of the 20th century, worker rights type laws, and the list goes on. So to be abundantly clear, it is that parliamentary sovereignty constitutional model that the He Puapua report wants to overturn. And they want to overturn or rewrite it in favor of one in which the Treaty of Waitangi and a UN declaration, so not even a treaty, not even a convention, but just a declaration, are wedged into some European-style written constitution that has strong judicial review at its heart, which will inevitably make your unelected top judges immensely more powerful. Or, if I can put it differently yet again, should anything like the desires of the He Puapua report come to pass, then democracy and democratic decision-making will be noticeably diminished, and they'll be diminished in favor of a process in which unelected top judges, chosen from the lawyerly caste, hold up the laws of the elected parliament against the treaty and against this UN declaration, and the judges tell the rest of us, all the rest of us voters, what passes muster and what does not. That which this committee of ex-lawyers rejects will be invalidated, nature of a written constitution. If listeners have not already discerned what I think about that sort of roadmap, then if I might purloin the terminology from the philosophy of psychiatry, let me just say, I think this is bonkers. So here are some more general claims or observations I'd make about the He Puapua report. Firstly, it trades in group rights thinking. So rather than allocating or affording rights to individuals, you accord them to particular groups of people who are lumped together in often arbitrary ways. Secondly, I think identity politics assumptions pervade this He Puapua report. And often when you deal in identity politics, how people fit into a particular group is, again, fairly arbitrary. And it certainly makes assumptions that not all people in the group would share. Thirdly, the report's assumptions and proposals, they push a sort of 50-50 co-governance model. And what that means is that one group representing about, 15, 20% of the population is put on the same level as everyone else, the other 85%, 80%. Normal democratic understandings be damned. You can sort of disguise this with happy clappy talk about partnership, remembering to have someone pull out a guitar and sing Kumbaya in the background. But at the heart of all co-governance guff is a sort of race-based or ethnic-based identity politics, where how you are treated depends to some extent on the genetic immutable characteristics you happen to have been born with. So I don't know of a single example for any country anywhere we're going down that divide the population up tribally or ethnically or by group has led to good outcomes. I don't even think they've led to tolerably, remotely tolerable outcomes. The fourth observation, the underlying assumptions that drive this He Puapua report are incompatible with any understanding of democracy that is procedural or premised on the old-fashioned notion that we all should count equally. We all get a vote for the MPs who, for the next 3 years in New Zealand, or 4 years in Canada, or 5 years in Britain, until the next election, will make all the big social policy calls. And to the extent there is any concern with democracy and democratic decision-making at all in He Puapua, it requires you to understand democracy in an incredibly morally pregnant way, a very substantive way that builds in a sort of substantive worldview about how things should be. And so effectively, the end result is that where democracy fits in your view of how life ought to be organized is very enervated or emasculated in this report. Fifthly, nowhere in the He Puapua report did the authors ever tell us how it will be determined who gets to be in the Maori group and who does not. Yes, will it be a genetic test? Will it be a blood test? What level of genetic similarity will you need? Will it be left up to some tribal elites to decide? Will it collapse into a sort of de facto self-identifying test? Nowhere in the report are we ever told, even though this is surely a pretty important issue on any sort of co-governance or partnership view of the world. And nor are we told the second order issue of, so the first order issue is who will be a Maori. The second order issue is who will have the power to decide if you meet the "Are you a Maori" test. So we don't know that either. Sixthly, so the sixth thing I would observe, and this is one of the things that really bugged me about this He Puapua report, but it's the way that it was the way in which it shamelessly elevated international law to the same level, heck, to a higher level, than the domestic law of New Zealand. So let's be clear about this. Any statute that's passed in New Zealand has incredibly high democratic credentials. Every citizen counts the same. You vote for an elected representative, and those elected MPs vote on statutes, or they vote against them. Sometimes you're on the winning side, and sometimes you're not. International law, by comparison, it barely has a democratic bone in its body. So let's take treaties and conventions, because customary international law is even more illegitimate in democratic terms. Now, in the English-speaking world, Americans take treaties seriously. So Bill Clinton went off and he signed up to the Kyoto Protocol, which is a type of treaty, but it didn't become part of US law. It didn't get ratified by the Americans because in the US you have to put treaties to the Senate, the upper house, and they need to get passed by a 2/3 supermajoritarian vote. It's really hard in the US to get any sort of treaty or convention ratified. And in the case of the Kyoto Protocol, that never happened. It couldn't get through the Senate. Compare that to the Westminster world. Westminster world is just a phrase that's used to signify all the countries that adopted the British Westminster model flowing out of London. So we're talking Canada, Britain, Australia, New Zealand, chunks of the Caribbean, India, those kind of countries. And in the Westminster world, excuse me, all treaties are entered into under the prerogative power, which is a phrase that basically means executive. So what's the prerogative power? Well, in really basic terms, this is the leftover executive power of the monarch. What remained in the centuries-long non-linear battle between the monarch, so you go back to the 16th century and Henry VIII, he was all-powerful, right? And Parliament, which basically had no power back then, and over the course of the next centuries, it flipped over in a non-linear way so that Parliament effectively had all the power. We still have the form of a sort of 16th century setup, but the reality is the monarch has no power. So since the time democracy went out, say the mid to late 19th century, this prerogative power, it's the leftover power of the monarch, has been exercised in Canada and Australia by the cabinet and by the prime minister. So still today, it's formally exercised in the name of the Queen or the Governor General, but the reality is that the party or parties that retain the confidence of the House, their leaders exercise it. So if in New Zealand, former Prime Minister John Key decides he wants to enter into some treaty, and he can convince his cabinet to fall in line behind him, then New Zealand ratifies it, full stop. No veto in Parliament, and no gainsaying by the elected Parliament. And the same goes for any UN declaration, which, to be clear, a declaration does not even have the status of a treaty or convention. It's below that. Right, so if John Key and his cabinet decide to sign up to the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, then he, or if you want to be charitable, then they, the cabinet, can. No referendum, no election, no vote in Parliament by your elected MPs. So I don't think I go too far out on a limb to say the democratic warrant or credentials of this UN declaration, or even of any treaty or convention entered into under the prerogative power, which is all of them, is significantly, you could say, massively on steroids below that of any statute passed by the New Zealand Parliament. You know, any statute found anywhere on the statute book has higher democratic credentials than a UN declaration that's been ratified into New Zealand law. So remember that. And yet, this UN declaration with these emasculated, enervated, second-rate democratic credentials, that is what the authors of the He Puapua want to hang their hat on. This is one of the key foundations of their entire building. So let me be blunt. The legitimacy of this foundation is so meager and skimpy, miserly and exiguous, that it's close to laughable. And the craftier non-lawyers in the audience will realize all this is why a treaty in the Westminster world is not, so let me emphasize this, is not considered to be part of the domestic law unless and until part or all of it is incorporated into a statute. So that's the trade-off. Easy to enter into treaties, but they don't have any status in domestic law until they're made part of a statute. And the even craftier amongst you will also realize this also applies to the Treaty of Waitangi. So absent incorporation into a statute, and the rule, or at least the old established time-tested rule, is that it has no legal status in the domestic law. It is true that the unelected judges are sort of modifying this at the periphery, especially with administrative law, but that's still the basic position. Seventh observation. On even a fairly cursory glance, readers of this He Puapua report will notice that there are continual demands, you guessed it, for more government money, and more government money for everything. It's the constant refrain of, and I quote, more resourcing needed. Now, of course, we all know that this is not in reality government's money. It's the money of all general taxpayers who fund government. They're the ones being called on to fund more Maori consultations, more reports, more increased returning of Crown lands, more implementing of Resource Management Act related Waitangi Tribunal recommendations. The calls for more money being repeated throughout the He Puapua report. And the sort of, given the time constraints, the eighth and final observation, or the last general claim that I'll make about this report, is the one I briefly mentioned above, namely its call, implicitly but also explicitly, for a complete remodeling of the New Zealand Constitution. Again, one of the world's longest standing constitutions and one of its most successful. And the authors of He Puapua want some sort of written constitution. It's very amorphous and undetailed. Apparently it will be overseen by powerful unelected judges who will exercise strong judicial review, and it will have the Treaty of Waitangi and the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples somehow stuffed into it. We're never told how, because, as I said, the readers are never given any details or suggestions of how this might look in practice. So those 8 initial general claims or observations, probably enough for me to make about this report tonight. I'm happy to take questions on any further or other details anyone might like to raise in question time. But instead, in the time that remains, let me move to giving you all what I see as the underlying premises of this He Puapua report. And I'll do that next. And then let me mention the 4 big themes that I covered in my response, and I will finish with a few thoughts on language and science. So that's what we're going to move to next. So here are the premises of the report, and this is in no particular order. But the core premises of this report, firstly, that Maori should exercise authority over Maori matters. And that sounds moderately innocuous, I suppose, until you wonder what Maori matters encompass. Never specified in the report. It's left an open question. And so too is the question of whether the reach or aegis of Maori matters is a stable, one-off division of the pie, or will it be an ongoing, flexible, capable of being ratcheted up in the future slicing of the pie? If the Canadian experience with the Charter of Rights is anything to go with, it will be the latter. It will be a continual ratchet up. Of course, and in theory, Maori matters could cover just about anything if you adopt a view that any law that has any effect on any Maori is a Maori matter. So none of this is specified. A second premise of the He Puapua report is that the land and resources need to be returned to Maori. This goes with more calls for considerable and new resourcing, so more taxpayer monies. A third premise is that Maori need to have a bigger say in resource management decisions as well as in local and central government. And here's another premise of the report. This is a big one. It's that group outcomes matter a lot, seemingly more than individual ones. So this takes us into deep waters about equality as compared to equity, about focusing on the individual, which is that's the hallmark of living in a liberal society, or focusing on some group. So equity is to be understood in terms of delivering group outcomes. You somehow define the particular group, Maori, women, any minority, it doesn't matter, and your goal is to deliver outcomes for the group, not for individuals, which requires you to make assumptions that everyone in the group has similar attitudes, desires, goals, whatever. And you do that rather than focus on equality or see the world in terms of equality of opportunity or of old-fashioned rule of law values, where you have general rules that apply to everyone the same, which are known, prospective, able to be complied with, the whole package of rule of law values. And as I've said already, much weight, an incredible amount, in fact, in this report is placed on international law, as though that somehow ought to be of a higher status than the domestic democratically enacted laws of New Zealand. And most obviously this is with the Declaration, but there's also elements of customary international law thinking that is used as a support. So indeed, an unspoken premise throughout this report is that where international law conflicts with domestic law, so the Declaration conflicts with statutes passed by the democratically elected legislature, and even case law decided by the New Zealand judiciary, that the former, international law, has greater worth or legitimacy. And it's that ought to prevail, or at least usually. And that position implicitly, or unspokenly, adopts a particular understanding of democracy, one where democracy is given a very low weight. And it adopts a particular view of how best to understand the concept of democracy, and it is one that is highly contestable. It's not self-evident, and I think it's actually wrong. The report also seems also to rest on the implicit view that there are two main players in life in New Zealand, two that count. One of these players falls under the aegis or rubric of Maori, and the other is everyone else, or the Crown, or the government, or all non-Maori. So these two players or actors, they're never defined, yet it is clear that individual New Zealanders, so all of the millions of New Zealanders with all their myriad outlooks, preferences, ambitions, goals, druthers, and the rest, are merely secondary actors to these two monolithic big players who will negotiate and educate and move these mooted reforms forward. So this premise can, of course, be cashed out in the language of a partnership or co-governance, but that barely disguises the fundamentally illiberal assumptions at work here, because it abandons focus on the individual, which is the hallmark of a liberal society, for one that sees everything through the prism or lens of groups or castes or some sort of ethnic solidarity. And moreover, where the populations comprising the two partners, in this case, are so uneven, about 1/6 in one partner group and about everyone else in the other partner group. So they're so uneven in raw numbers. This implicit model again raises very big questions about democracy and legitimacy. So those, along with the push to jettison New Zealand's current constitutional structures, are the core premises of the He Puapua report. And so in writing my reply, my 4 big themes, which I'm just going to point out, you can read the report to get the detail. But as a result of those premises, my responding report considered in some detail the 4 pillars that I thought needed elucidating and in some cases puncturing. So I spent time explaining the concept of democracy to show how enervated is the view of the authors of He Puapua. Next, I looked at the notion of the rule of law, which historically and traditionally is a pretty important concept for similar reasons. Thirdly, I spent a fair bit of time on outlawing international law, in part how I have just done already, but that's also important given the weight it's put on it. And lastly, I looked at the desire for constitutional transformation. And I argued that it would make things worse, not better. So the nature of democracy, the rule of law, international law, and the desirable extent of its authority and sway, which for me is very low, and evaluating constitutional transformation. Those were the 4 big themes that I considered in my responding report. And again, I'm happy to elaborate on any of those in question time. Lastly, language and science. I'm going to round out this talk tonight by mentioning 2 peripheral matters. Now, these are not central to any reply to the He Puapua report, but I think they're worth raising. The first is about the widespread use of Maori terms and labels in this He Puapua report. Very, very often they're not defined, so they're left undefined, or at least not defined in any way at all that eliminates ambiguity and vagueness. If anything, the use of these Maori phrases trades in ambiguity and obfuscation. What is the point? That's what I found myself wondering as I fired up Mr. Google from time to time to try to get a basic understanding of some of these terms. So let's be blunt. If you are born in New Zealand, and despite the best efforts of the education system, you speak English, you are lucky. Just as the US dollar is the world's reserve currency, the English language is the world's reserve language. Through no credit of yourself, through no credit due to you, you have in effect won the lottery. I go off to law conferences in Portugal or Asia. Everyone speaks English. This is not anything due to my worth, but I'm lucky. So the Germans, the French, the Scandinavians, the Japanese, the Chinese, they all give their papers in English. If you're born in a country where English is the first language, it is effectively akin to winning the lottery. You cannot write a scientific paper today that anyone will read that is not published in English. Now again, this is no merit to anyone, but in almost every field of human endeavor, by luck, and it's just pure luck, English is a huge advantage. It's the same way that if you go through and are part of the common law world, so you are educated in a law school in the common law part of the world, that is a huge advantage. If you go to law school in New Zealand or India or Singapore or Canada or Australia, you can get a job in New York in a law firm. You can get a job in London because the common law system is shared in 2/3 of the world. If you get educated in the German Roman law, civil law system, you have to learn the common law system to get a job outside of Germany. And so this is, again, just luck. But what is going on with these attempts, I wondered, not just in this He Puapua report, but more and more by New Zealand government departments, to shift to an undefined use of the Maori language. And I'm married to a woman who speaks French. She learned it in 2 years living in France. Now, she's been in Australia for 17 years and New Zealand for 11, so it's pretty rusty. But I mean, I used to get by in French, so I understand that there's great things about speaking a second language. But to make it the main focus in a world where everyone else is trying to learn English, it struck me as very odd in this report. I mean, even the European Union, with Britain out, operates de facto in English. So I came to the conclusion that peppering this report with a liberal sprinkling of Maori terms and phrases, and again, often without translation, it struck me as simply a political act that obfuscates contentious claims. Second peripheral point I'd like to raise, and it's solely this one because it irked me so much. So let me give you some background. During my 11 years in New Zealand, I was a member of something called the New Zealand Skeptics. That was back when that organization was headed up by the late, now deceased, but wonderful Dennis Dutton of Christchurch. He was a great man. And we in the New Zealand Skeptics would meet once a year, and effectively you took the mickey out of people who believed in UFO sightings, or they thought that they could get some homeopathic remedy and that would actually work, right? So when you learn that homeopathy is 1 atom per universe and it's diluted in water and it's never passed a double-blind drug trial ever, you wonder why people buy these sorts of things. And so we would make fun of that. And the core thing that brought an eclectic group of people together under the banner of the New Zealand Skeptics, so there were doctors, there were engineers, there were lawyers, there were quite a few people who led very alternative lifestyles. They were out surfing all the time, but they had a commitment to the sort of scientific worldview that has delivered the best living standards in the history of human life, that has delivered a doubling of life expectancy in the last 130 years. So we had this commitment to what the great Scottish philosopher David Hume's sort of understanding of human reason and his thoroughgoing skepticism. And so it was that sort of view of the world, that Humean skepticism, that made him such an empiricist. That you look at this and sort of underlay the scientific worldview. Well, my point is that back then, I'm not sure about today, but those of us in the New Zealand Skeptics, we were big on free speech, big on science, and big on empiricism as the route to truth. Nobody was woke or took offense. So imagine my reaction on reading this He Puapua report when I reached page 74 and I see the authors assert the need to, and I'm quoting, ensure that Mataranga Maori is equally valued and resourced as Western science. So this was an example, by the way, of using a Maori phrase and not defining it. But according to Mr. Google, the term Mataranga Maori means something like Maori knowledge or traditional Maori knowledge. But again, the report doesn't define the term. But here's the thing, or at least this is how I responded in my report. And I'm quoting myself, that's always fun. Science is science, to be frank. It has delivered the most spectacular increases in human welfare, increases that no one could have imagined even a century ago. And all people, all New Zealanders, benefit from the advances driven by this so-called Western science. For the report, the He Puapua report, to suggest that somehow this scientific worldview and method is tainted due to where it emerged in the world, or that it offers no better answers in medicine, in food production, in international travel, pick any field you want, than traditional knowledge does, is simply laughable. The claim can only be advanced because most people are too polite actually to laugh. So that's how I responded to my report. 150 years ago, people in the West, leave aside traditional Maori life, had an expected lifespan that didn't reach the 40s. Today it's in the high 80s for women. When someone gets cancer, if they opt for Mataranga Maori, there is no benefit to pretending that choice is equally valid to opting for Western medicine. In fact, you're a fool if you do. So not only that, I am sure, dead sure, that were the authors of He Puapua to become gravely ill with cancer, say, they would opt for chemotherapy as they should. So this sort of genuflecting in the vague direction of, a sort of cultural relativism and laughable virtue signaling pieties really only diminishes this He Puapua report. At least that's my view. So I think I'm going to end there. Many of you will realize that the Ardern government, despite protestations that this He Puapua report is not really driving its legislative agenda, despite those protestations, you'll realize that the Arduin government are making the sort of moves that He Puapua envisioned, or that its authors hoped for. 3 waters, the health reforms. Democracy Action will be commissioning a later report on these explicit bills and laws, not by me, but by someone more knowledgeable than I. But I raise them to indicate that I, like you, am aware of what is happening. My view is that the response to this, the proper response, is political. Vote for parties that promise to repeal the whole ethnically driven and racially driven suite of laws that ends up being passed by the Arduin government. Many oppositions around the democratic world run shy of repealing laws they think are wrong-headed. That is a mistake. Voters want principled politicians. Voters don't agree about the sort of principles they want enacted, but they want principled politicians. And on principles, these are all, in my view, malign and insidious laws that need to be repealed. So let me stop there and take questions. Thank you very much.